Hello folks, I'm Alex, this is Alex Unabridged, and these are 10 books that made me. So welcome back to the channel if that is the case. Yes, 10 books that made me for you today. I first saw this sort of video over on Olly. Olly did this. I think this was something he came up with himself. And I loved that video. I think it was a great idea to look back at, the important books from your past, things that have made an impact on you as a reader and, your evolution as a reader, but also as a person, I think, as well. And I've seen various other folks do their own versions of this since and enjoyed every single one of them. They've all been fantastic. And seeing as I'm in a slump at the moment and my reading's a little bit wobbly, I thought a lovely thing to do would be to look back at my reading history. So I've got 10 for you today. I could have picked a lot more, but these are the 10 that I've come up with for this video. Most of these I've read sort of from being a kid through to being about 30 or 35. There's only one which is more of a recent read. So let's start at childhood then with Bunny Rabbit Rebus. This is the first book I remember being obsessed with. I would have been a very little kid. I would have been probably I'd have learnt to read a bit, for sure. And I remember first reading this with my mum, but then it became something that I just returned to again and again and again and again, because it is a rebus, a story in words and pictures. So it uses little pictures or pictograms to replace some words or some syllables of words, things like that. And I loved the kind of code sort of element of it, the deciphering it element of it as a kid. It was kind of like a bit of a game, as well as, reading the story. And I think probably in retrospect as well, it was a really kind of cool thing for me to be able to read something on my own without mum, using the pictures. And probably really helped kind of improve my fluency of my reading. I never had any trouble, finding people who would, be great at teaching me to read. I had a great school, plus my mum was a passionate reader herself, but also a primary school head teacher with a specialism in English. So reading was a big deal in our house. But yeah, I do remember just loving the combination of the words and the pictures in this, and having something that I could sit down and read myself again and again and again. And I am still fascinated by the concept, the idea of a rebus, and I'm still, I still like to look for things that use that kind of idea even today. So yeah, really, really important one for me as a really little kid. Staying with childhood then, we've got the first book I think I remember being read to us, I think by mum, but then being also on an audio cassette, I think. Might have been vinyl, but I think it was a cassette. And that's Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame. Oh, that got played over and over and over again. It was important because it was something that I think my sister and I both shared a love of, and was something we could have a shared experience of. And, at our own kind of whim as well. We weren't waiting for mum to be free to read us the story at bedtime or whatever. We could just put it on whenever we wanted. I would have been probably around 7-ish, something like that. So my sister's a couple of years younger than me. But we shared a bedroom. I remember it being a regular feature of our days, when we were up in our room. And so that's one lovely thing I remember about it, is that kind of shared experience over a book. But I think this one is really important because I think this is what inspired my love of nature. I loved the creatures in it, but I loved the setting of it as well, the rural setting of it as a kid. And it made me kind of want to know more about the creatures, the environments, things like that. And within that sort of time period when this was a big thing for me, I started going off with my parents to start with, and then later on my own to kind of youth nature groups, meetups, things like that, where we'd go to a local nature reserve and we'd look at bugs through those kind of magnifying boxes, and we'd learn all about them, and we'd learn about the creatures, and we'd learn about the trees and the plants and all that kind of stuff, things like that. And that was kind of an interest and a love of nature that's kind of continued right on through to till today. And very specifically, this is the book I can pinpoint as the beginning of my love for mustelids. Mustelids are the group of animals that include badgers, stoats, weasels, ferrets, pine martens. I love pine martens. Otters, stuff like, and more, and others. And I love all of them. And I'm pretty darn sure that this is the book that started that off. Okay, staying in childhood then with number 3, the last one really of childhood. And these are the first books I remember reading, wanting to read myself, taking myself off to read as a private little activity. And I say books because I can't pinpoint one particular book, more a series of books by this author, and that is the Enid Blyton kind of fantasy books. So things like the Enchanted Wood, the Magic Faraway Tree series, also the Wishing Chair series. I did read pretty much anything that Enid Blyton wrote when I was a kid, but these are the ones that I really remember just devouring the series of. My mum gave me the first one, the Enchanted Wood, really old copy of it, and that was it. I was in. And I wanted to take myself off, find a quiet little corner of the house all to myself, shut out the world, and just read and get lost in these stories. And so, yeah, these are the first ones I remember really just being my experience, just for me, with the book, getting lost in it. I'd love to reread these at some point, although I'm a little I'm a little concerned that they won't have aged well at all. But I think they are worth a reread, just in terms of reminding myself of some of the randomness in them that I loved. Some of the imagination of the worlds that you'd find at the top of the faraway tree, and the random characters that you'd find in them. So yeah, I think I will do a reread eventually. Or maybe a re-listen. Maybe that'd be a good one for an audiobook. Okay, so out of childhood and into teenagedom, and this one's quite a big one for informing my reading as an adult, and that's The Shining by Stephen King. This was the first proper adult horror. I think probably one of the first proper adult books that I read when I was about 15 or 16. I'd read a little bit of horror, like middle grade sort of horror, YA horror maybe, is what you'd call it, when I was about 12 or 13. So a couple of point horrors really, which I enjoyed. But I was always a scaredy cat as a kid. I still am, really. Certainly when it comes to visual stuff. I hated horror movies back then, and I'm still not a massive fan today. The odd one, as long as I know it's not going to terrify me. But horror in visual form is just not good for me. And so I'd kind of steered clear of horror novels as well in terms of adult stuff, thinking it'd be too scary for me. But some of my friends at school were talking about this author, Stephen King, and I wanted to be included in the discussions. But also I was intrigued. I was intrigued by some of the stories that they were talking about. And there was a few I could have picked from things that people had read, but I went for The Shining. I liked the sound of The Shining, and got it out of the library and took it away on holiday with me to read in a hotel in the mountains. Certainly helped with the atmosphere. And I just fell in love with it entirely. It was one of those where I could not wait to get back to the hotel during the day to read more. I loved the character work in it. I loved the slow burn of it as well. Um, I liked I liked the fact that the visuals that were conjured were just scary enough for me. They gave me that thrill that you want with a horror book, but they weren't so terrifying that I couldn't read it or that it gave me nightmares. It was exactly the right level. And I think that's something I found over the years as well as I kept reading horror is that that's the way for me to experience horror is by reading it or even better audiobooks that pushes it a bit further but still not enough to give me nightmares fortunately as far as my experience goes anyway. So yeah, it was definitely a formative reading experience in terms of it kicked me off on a lot of Stephen King stuff, and I then went and read loads more King over the next sort of 20 years, and just a love of horror. It made me branch out from King in my 20s and read other horror authors. And I basically read horror and very little else for the next 15, 20 years. Okay, book number 5 then. The only non-fiction book on this list, and that is Gender Trouble by Judith Butler. This one, I mean, it's a seminal text for gender theory, queer theory. I read it when I was probably 21, 22. I was a final year drama student at the time. And we were doing a module on gender and sexuality and performance. So we were looking at some gender theory, and this was one that popped up. And yeah, quite a difficult text to read, but it's got quite an impenetrable writing style, and I was pretty damn chuffed when I actually managed to get through it and understand it eventually. The theory itself is not that difficult to understand, I don't think, but the actual act of reading it was quite something. But this just informed so much of how I ended up thinking about the world, my place in it, all that kind of stuff. Yes, it was super important for introducing me to gender theory, for making me question my understanding of gender and my understanding of my own gender, and opening up a whole wealth of possibilities for a different way to be, which then branched me out to other thinkers, artists, writers, etc., all of which kind of dealt with similar stuff or embodied kind of this sort of gender theory in their work, a lot of whom were trans. And it's just my part is the kind of the real kind of initial point of me finding something that helped me understand as I say, my own gender. It's kind of what gave me something to grab onto to try and figure out like what I was feeling that I couldn't put a name to, that I didn't have any clue what was going on in my head. So yeah, it's important in that respect, but I think it's bigger than that. It's not just about the content of that book in terms of gender that's important. It's actually the bigger thing is that it was a point from which I could kind of spider web out to other thinkers, not about gender, just philosophy, sociology, anthropology. It was kind of the entrance to the rabbit hole, if you like. And yeah, Butler's written a really important book in Gender Trouble, but she's drawing from lots of other philosophers, sociologists, etc. And so I could take that as a starting point and go and find more about these other thinkers that had come before. So it introduced me to people like Hegel and Simone de Beauvoir, and one of the big ones for me was Merleau-Ponty, who wrote The Phenomenology of Perception, which is another quite significant book for me. Because all of these thinkers that I found were all ended up being instrumental in my understanding of the world, my own place in it, how I experience it, my connection with it and others, all that kind of stuff. So it really did start to make me kind of understand myself a lot more, as I say, through this like dive into the rabbit hole. It's whilst the gender stuff within it was very important as well, I think I credit it more for just being kind of the start point, the open door to a whole world of philosophy that I ended up absolutely loving, that I studied a little of, but more I just kind of read for my own interest. So yeah, that was I read quite a lot of that in my 20s, and really enjoyed it, and really enjoyed how it made me think. So yeah, that was quite an important one for me. As I say, like a bit of a pivot point book, that one. Okay, book number 6 then, back into the fiction, and that is with The Minotaur Takes a Cigarette Break by Stephen Sherrill. I've mentioned this on the channel a few times before. I picked this one because this was an example of the perfect book at the perfect time for me. I was given this as a gift in 2006 by a good friend of mine, who actually happened to be the lecturer who introduced me to gender trouble. I was a postgrad student when I got this, and I was also at the point at which I was trying to figure out what the hell to do about transitioning. How to go about it. Was it the right thing? Was I going to lose everything? It was terrifying, and I was in quite a dark spot with it. And yeah, it was a tough time. And my friend gave me this book. I realized when I read it was her way of imparting something to me, was just her way of offering a message, some comfort, some kind of recognition of maybe what I was feeling. And I think the power of that kind of connection with someone through the gift of a book, of a story, is something quite significant, something that I've learned is, really something really lovely and that means a hell of a lot. This was also a great example, though, of how fiction that is on the surface seemingly very alien to your experiences. This is about the Minotaur, who is 2,000 years out of the labyrinth, has evolved somewhat in terms of his kind of psychology to be slightly more human, but still looks very much like the Minotaur. And he's working as a cook in a steakhouse in the American South. So on the surface, absolutely, kind of no relationship to my life whatsoever. But it is at its heart about isolation, about alienation, about being a misfit, but about that need for human connection, and about finding love, finding that connection, that real humanity. And that really struck a chord for me when I read this at that moment in my life. This was the perfect book for me at that point. There is a melancholy nature to it, and that was kind of my mood generally at the time as well. But just how, for me, it's just like how someone pinpointed what I needed and came up with the perfect book for it. Do you know what I mean? It's like that connection with someone else, as well as with the story and with the writing, and I love the book. But I think part of my love for it is the fact that it was such a thoughtful thing to give me, and it's that connection with my friend, I think, that I valued just as much as the book itself. So yeah, really, really lovely, important book to me for a very specific moment in my life. Okay, next up then, book number 7 is 1984 by George Orwell. This one's significant for me because, as I said before, I didn't read much fiction other than horror for a long time. The Minotaur Takes a Cigarette Break is one of the few things that I read that wasn't horror. This is another. And this I read because of a recommendation, or rather, I should say, really, a mandate from my wife. Although I think she probably wasn't my wife at the time. I think before we were married. Um, but she could not believe that I was in my late 20s, whenever it was, and I hadn't read this. It's one of her favourites. I think she first read it at like 16 and has read it several times since. And she kind of, she said, you really ought to read it. And you like horror, you like dark things, read it. And yeah, she's right. This was the first non-horror book that really unsettled me. I think it was my first dystopia, which sent me off down another rabbit hole to dystopias. This one is an interesting one just in terms of like my kind of, again, another connection with somebody, my connection with my wife, in terms of like we had very different tastes, and still do. In fact, one might look at us and think, how the hell do you two get on? You have very little in common. But, opposites attract and all that. But we didn't read the same things. And this was one of the books that really got us talking about, a piece of literature. And really just not just the literature itself, but like really talking about then some of the politics behind it. I hadn't been politically kind of active or really that politically minded. I kind of was politically minded when it came to things like LGBTQ stuff. But outside of that, politics, I was like, ugh, politics. I voted and stuff like that, but I wasn't, politically active or, really interested. And that kind of changed that, plus the discussion with my wife afterwards changed that. And she sent me off to kind of read, other political philosophy, things like that. So I ended up reading the Communist Manifesto, things like On Liberty by John Stuart Mill, Locke, Hobbes, Kant, Rousseau, people like that. And so it opened that door again to more philosophy. So it's like, again, it's another one that's, kind of a start point, at the beginning of a rabbit hole. And I do appreciate that. But as I say, likewise, it's also another one where I found the value of a book in terms of being able to discuss it afterwards and connect with somebody, because of an experience that we've both had, a different experience, not and years apart, but still that's the importance of not just reading a book but discussing it as well, I think. And this one definitely remains, a powerful book to me, and one that I have returned to and reread since my first read of it. So yeah, 1984. Okay then, book number 8 is this one, The Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafón. And this one I read based on a recommendation from my mum. I had always really loved talking about books, reading books, etc. and talking about books with my mum when I was a kid. But then once I hit my teens and got into the horror and stuff, and read very little other than that, I lost that connection with my mum regarding books. We were always very close and we always would find plenty to talk about. But we did lose that ability to talk about what we were reading and be passionate about it together, because she read incredibly different things to me. She never read horror. I wasn't interested in a lot of the stuff that she read. And her big passion is books. And so it felt a little bit disappointing, a little bit sad to have lost that. But she recommended this to me, because she thought, it's a literary mystery. It's quite a magical read. It's a very beautiful read. And she figured I'd probably quite like the mystery sort of element to it. And the stuff about books, the kind of the forgotten library that's in this. And yes, she was right. I loved this, absolutely loved it. And it was a really important one for both of us because it gave us something to really, be passionate, talk passionately about together and discuss. We read the rest of the series of it, but then we both ended up kind of going and searching out other authors that might be a bit similar. and kind of going on a hunt together to find, stuff that we both would like that, was similar to this. And so it introduced us to a lot of new authors for both of us, most notably Umberto Eco, who became a favourite. And that gave us so much to talk about because Eco's pretty dense as well. There's a lot to get through in his books. And not just the stories and the structures and things like that, but the writing itself, the vocabulary, the ideas, the kind of, just, I'd say, the denseness of those books is a joy. It's difficult, but it's a joy. They are challenging reads, but they are a joy to get through. It's a joy to do the work that is required to read them. And then from Echo, as I say, we went on and found even more. And he really just gave us that as I say, that kind of shared passion back. I didn't read, I didn't start reading loads of other stuff at that time. I kind of had my horror, and then I had the stuff I read with my mum, But it all came from this one because mum recommended it. And as I say, it took us off down another rabbit hole. It's, another theme in this list. I love a rabbit hole. Something that will spark me off on a journey to find lots of other different things that fascinate me. Being able to do that with someone else like my mum was just fantastic. So this one does hold a very special place for me because of that. Okay, number 9 then. Book number 9 is one I don't think people will be surprised to see on this list. And that's The Passage. Although I am going to make this the series. I'm going to, it's a bit of a cheat because it's 3 books, but it is all one story. The Passage, the first book, is by far and away the best, but I do love the whole trilogy. And this one I think is important for me because it's the first sort of time really as an adult that I kind of felt like this was just mine. It's like certainly the trilogy, because there wasn't a huge amount of hype for it in the UK, the series. And I mean, I discovered the first one by accident. I was in Waterstones and they had a printed excerpts, just the first chapter, there for free, to try and market it. And I picked it up because it was free and because it was touted as a horror. So I thought, well, all right, I'll go and take this home and read it. And it took me a little while to read it, but as soon as I did, I was in. I was like, this is great. I love this. I love the tone of it. I love the feel of it. It's mysterious. I kind of want to know more. And so I bought it and read it and fell absolutely in love with it. But I wasn't hearing anybody else talk about it at all. But I didn't mind. It just it felt, for some reason, this book just feels almost like it's written for me. And I was so excited for the second one. And I think that's another big point for me. I'd never really felt that kind of real anticipation, excitement for the next installment in a series. I had, to a certain extent, with the Harry Potter books. I had enjoyed that kind of excitement of the next one, but that was very, very influenced by the fact that it was all over the shop and everybody was looking forward to it. The media was all over it. There were millions of people all talking about it, and it was more about that kind of hype, I think, that I was a part of, that was kind of that was the reason why I was excited. Whereas with this, I was excited despite the fact that no one else that I knew or I could see anywhere else was really talking about it. And that continued, into book 3 as well. That was a flipping long wait though between book 2 and 3. That was 4 years. I think when I read the first one, I only had a year or so to wait for the second, which was okay. I was eagerly anticipating, but that wasn't too bad. But yeah, and I read the second one on day one, purchased it day one of release and read it very quickly. But then I had 4 years to wait, and that was excruciating, absolutely excruciating. But I didn't mind. because I mean I reread the first two a couple of times in that period, but it is just one of those where I don't remember anybody talking about it, and there being like loads of hoo-ha about it and stuff. I don't think there was, but I didn't care because it, as I say, it just felt like mine. Don't know whether anybody can kind of like relate to that feeling when a book just feels like it's just for you, and you're quite happy for it to be just for you. As much as sometimes I wish I saw more people talking about this on BookTube, I also don't really mind that not a lot of people talk about it, because it's kind of it's just mine. It's just for me, this one, and I love it dearly. And so I don't really care that if no one else kind of feels the same level of passion for it than me, or very few people do. Okay, and finally we've got to number 10. I've probably rambled on way too long on this, but hey, it's me. Number 10 then is a recent read for me within the last 2 or 3 years, and that's Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. And I've picked this one because this is really the book that I pinpoint as the start of my love for science fiction books, literature. It's also the best audio experience I have ever had, and thoroughly cemented my love of audiobooks. That's another big deal about it, actually. I'd listened to audiobooks a bit before that, a fair bit. I'd got into them during the pandemic. But this was the book that really just knocked my socks off of like how good an audiobook can be. But yeah, it's the fact that it's the start of my my forays into science fiction, very specifically space-based science fiction. I had read dystopias in the past, which I'd enjoyed, but I hadn't really read a huge amount of kind of spacey stuff. In fact, I didn't think I would like it, and I only picked up Project Hail Mary because BookTube told me to. I didn't have my channel at that point, but I had been, watching and lurking, and taking notes, and I kept seeing this one pop up on folks, top tens and things like that. And I thought, well, I ought to give it a go. Really, it sounds like fun. It might be set in space, which not sure I like, but it sounds like it would be fun. And I'd seen it in 2-for-1 sale, so I went, well, 2 for 1, no harm, no foul. Give it a go. So glad I did. So glad I did. And it just made me kind of go, well, you obviously can like space stuff then. So maybe try some more. Maybe have a little look what else is out there in science fiction, because there's probably quite a lot that you actually will like. It took me a while because it's very daunting trying to figure out what to go for next. But I did, I did a whole month of science fiction last September, and that then was like, yeah, okay, I really need to properly think about exploring this in a much wider way. Hence why I've now got my Science Fiction for the Somewhat Hesitant project, which I've been doing this year, which has been probably one of the best things I've ever done, and that's not hyperbole. The amount of value that I get out of that project and reading this sort of stuff is kind of immeasurable in a way. It's like I already talked about how much value I've had out of philosophy in the past, and I don't want to read, philosophy original texts anymore. I did that in my 20s and I really enjoyed it, but that's not what my reading is these days. But science fiction is where the philosophy is. That's how I get my philosophy fix. That's how I ask, that's how I'm asked those questions. That's what challenges me to really think the big thoughts, ask the big questions, all that kind of stuff. It's the mind melty stuff, and I like the mind melty. And I'm kicking myself that I just kind of went, I don't think I like that, years ago, which I used to do quite a bit, to be fair. You know, the stupidity of youth. Oh, I don't think I like that, so I won't bother trying. Yeah, no. Now this is why I'll try anything once, because I may well be very, very wrong when I think I don't like something. Um, so yes, so Project Hail Mary, the start of my love, my true love for science fiction, which is now equal, you know, in my affections to horror. So that was quite a big deal. So there we go, folks. Those are the 10 books that made me. That will do from me today. Thank you very much for watching, folks, especially if you're still here at the end of this. Much appreciated. Do drop your thoughts in the comments below. It's always lovely to hear from you, and I'd love to know what books made you. Do we have any crossovers, anything like that? I will be back on Sunday with a revised version of my top 10 fiction. Looking back at these books has also made me rethink some of my fiction, my top 10 choices, which I did 20 months ago when I first joined BookTube, and I have read a lot of fiction since. So I needed to tweak that list a little bit. I needed to go back over and rethink that. So I will be presenting the revised edition on Sunday. So I do hope you will join me for that then. But from me, for now, that's ta-ra.